Let me just get my screen sharing set up here. Well, good evening, everyone. I'll start by saying that I am here in the land and unceded territory of the Abenaki people. The Abenaki have been here since time immemorial and continue to be a thriving Indigenous culture in our region. We acknowledge with gratitude their generations of stewardship, past, present, and future. Thank you so much, Tom, and to all of you for having me. I'm Susan Evans-McClure, and I'm the Executive Director of Lake Champlain Maritime Museum. We are located over here in Vermont. And before we get started about the Clean Water Act, I'll tell you a bit about our museum. So this is a photo of our 3-acre waterfront campus located just outside of Vergennes, Vermont. We're a museum dedicated to inspiring people to make personal connections to Lake Champlain through our region's history, ecology, and archaeology. We believe that when people see themselves in our past, they make a stronger commitment to building a healthy future for all of us and for the lake and for our communities. The museum opened in 1985, and today we welcome around 10,000 students and visitors to experience our exhibits, our boat building programs, our rowing programs, and our educational outreach. Our team also builds new boats and does new archaeological research, as well as stewarding a collection of objects, artifacts, materials, and archives. The COVID-19 pandemic and the national reckoning on racial justice have given us a chance to really assess what is important to us and what we want to achieve in partnership with our community. And to us, it's all about access. The lake and the history that lies within it belong to the people of Vermont and New York and a little bit of Quebec. And we want to make it possible for everyone to experience that for themselves with no barriers to that access. So we no longer charge admission to the museum. It's completely free. And all of our summer camps are on a pay what you can basis. We're also taking steps to make our campus more accessible and our programs physically accessible. And we're working to make the lake and the lake's underwater cultural heritage more accessible to everyone too. We're open for the 2022 season through mid-October, so please come and visit us. And you can also check out our virtual programming and our digital museum on our website, where we hope you'll visit us as well. So as Tom started off with, the 2022, this year, does mark the 50th anniversary of the Clean Water Act, the nation's first comprehensive legislation protecting water quality. Life in the Champlain Valley has always been and continues to be deeply connected to the water of Lake Champlain. This monumental legislation expanded federal protections of the waters of the United States, paving the way for policies, protections, and funding dedicated towards clean water. Subsequent amendments to the Act strengthened protections for Lake Champlain, which created the Lake Champlain Basin program and helped us to protect the water of the lake for generations to come. This is an image of the whole Lake Champlain Basin. Lake Champlain itself is 120 miles long and located between 2 states and 2 countries. And not only is the lake itself central and fascinating and historic and all sorts of other things that make my job endlessly interesting, it's also part of a much larger basin shown here on this map. So the Lake Champlain Basin is 8,234 square miles, which actually is 19 times larger than the surface area of the lake itself. All of this region's interconnected environment and people and industry and outputs impact what happens below the water surface. The Indigenous communities of Lake Champlain have always had a strong relationship between the people and the water. The Abenaki community have been present in this region where I am, which we now call Vermont, since time immemorial, and continue to be a thriving Indigenous culture here. Nebizun is the Abenaki word for medicine, and the root Nevi is the Abenaki word for water. As stewards of the environment, Native Americans have led and continue to advocate for clean water. The Abenaki people know how essential water is to foodways and everyday life. And both the Abenaki and the Iroquois creation stories are based in water. Now, those are not my stories to tell, but if you haven't heard them, I suggest you listen to them told aloud by an Indigenous community member. And in this image, Vera Longtoshian, a member of the Elnu Abenaki tribe and the director of the Vermont Abenaki Artists Association, is making a traditional fish net. And the painting you see here is by an Abenaki artist named Francine Poitras Jones, and it's titled Water is Life. It's on display in the Vermont Abenaki Artists Association exhibit called Nebizun, Water is Life, which is on display at the Maritime Museum this summer. And while this story is about late 19th century federal legislation, My job is to start way before that. So we'll start in my favorite century, the 19th century. So the 1800s brought industrialization and pollution to the shores of Lake Champlain, altering the landscape and the water quality. These changes gave rise to numerous individual and state level concerns about the protection of the lake, which ended up launching an early conservationist movement in our area. So in the years following the War of 1812, the nation underwent a series of economic changes that dramatically changed the economic and physical landscape. In the early 1800s, the exchange of goods occurred in local markets and communities. Some towns, like Burlington, used horse-drawn transportation and carriages to take their goods to other communities or distant markets. But these transportation methods were slow and costly. This image that you're looking at here is of a man named William Montgomery on the stern of his schooner, the J.P. Howard, in the 1880s. This image is from the Isle La Motte Historical Society. And I will say, if you look closely at it, I have stared and stared and zoomed and tried to figure out what is in those barrels. And I have no idea what is in those barrels, but lots of things were moved in barrels in canal boats along Lake Champlain in the 19th and 20th centuries. So by the mid-1800s, the population in this region boomed and demand for a variety of products increased, which required faster and cheaper transportation methods. In 1817, New York State launched the construction of the Champlain Canal, which workers completed in 1823. The canal linked Lake Champlain and the Hudson River, opening a new world of markets and dramatically decreasing the cost of shipping. With the 1825 opening of the Erie Canal, New York City and the Atlantic Ocean were now connected to the Great Lakes, which ushered in a new era of international and national economic production and trade, where products and people were really more tightly linked than ever before. The speed of canal transportation and the enticing potential for profit brought big physical changes to the landscape of Lake Champlain and the region. With the opening of the Champlain Canal, the cost to ship goods from Burlington, Vermont to New York City dropped by 90%. So what used to cost $10 a ton now cost $1 a ton. The image of a canal boat, this image that you're looking at here is of a canal boat in the 1890s, and it's from the Fort Ticonderoga's collections. So to satisfy this demand for products, hundreds of dams, mills, mines, furnaces, charcoal kilns, and farms appeared along both sides of the lake, using the resources of the water and the forest to sustain their enterprises. Steamboats and canal boats regularly traveled up and down the lake, ready to deliver products and people to distant markets and places. And these physical changes created by increased transportation and resource extraction had a real negative impact on the water quality of Lake Champlain. Deforestation, pollution, runoff, and the dumping of waste affected the water quality and ecological systems and really harmed the animal and plant life. This image, which I just find so striking because it is so crisp and clear, is from the Vermont Historical Society, and it's of Burlington Harbor in the late 1800s. One species that was significantly affected by these changes were salmon. Early travelers to the region noted Atlantic salmon living and reproducing in Lake Champlain for centuries before the 1800s. So these were salmon who spawned in the rivers that connected to Lake Champlain, but then went all the way back out to the Atlantic Ocean. And in the early 1800s, they were extremely plentiful. Stories of horses being too spooked to cross rivers that were teeming with salmon weren't unheard of. But by 1838, one writer noted that the salmon had, quote, abandoned all the waters of the Champlain systems. The infrastructure that had positively served the growing economy had actually destroyed the ability of salmon to live in Lake Champlain. Dams prevented the salmon from being able to reproduce in streams. The loss of trees increased the runoff from the mountains and the land, and mills dumped waste into the lake, polluting the water. So economic and social expansion was coming at a cost of environmental damage. The loss of species such as salmon, the poor water quality, and the changing physical landscape really alarmed citizens and writers and researchers of the time. Travelers, conservationists, and naturalists such as Zadok Thompson, DeWitt Clinton, Charles Sprague Sargent, and George Perkins Marsh recorded their observations of the lake and its inhabitants for scientific reports. They all connected the industrialization that was happening with the environmental changes and the damaged ecosystems, which created the scientific understanding of the world that would launch an early conservation movement. And it wasn't just these researchers and conservationists, It was also local and state governments that took notice of these changes and started to create their own agencies to try to reverse the harm that was being done to the environment. Quebec, Vermont, and New York established fish commissions to regulate fishing in Lake Champlain in this time period, and the federal government soon followed, creating the Federal Commission on Fish and Fisheries in 1871 to protect fish in lakes and rivers, actually across the United States. New York also passed two bills in 1892 and 1894 to create the Adirondack Park and designate it as forever wild to protect the region's waterways and forests. So as the 19th century ended, almost every aspect of life in and around Lake Champlain had changed. Local community markets transformed into distant national ones. The Atlantic salmon that once densely populated the lake disappeared, along with the forests surrounding the lake. In the wake of these changes, the early conservationist movement formed that would set the stage for years to come, eventually culminating in the Clean Water Act in 1972. So at the start of the 20th century, ongoing scientific research was documenting the impact of pollution on Lake Champlain, but little political action was being taken on water quality. Now in 1905, following a series of complaints from residents about discharge of waste into Lake Champlain from mills, the Federal Department of the Interior commissioned a report on pollution in the lake. The report detailed a series of concerns about the declining water quality, and it actually issued a dire warning for Burlington residents. Without any sewage treatment plants, they said, the residents of Burlington were discharging their raw waste directly into the lake. One of the investigators of this report bluntly stated that the residents of Burlington were, quote, drinking from their own cesspool. So clean water efforts were gaining attention as their impacts affected the lives of people living in the region. And this is an image of the cover of the report, the preliminary report on the pollution of Lake Champlain that was printed by the government printing office in 1905. So it's not as though the federal government were doing nothing at all, but it was doing kind of close to nothing. In 1899, the Rivers and Harbors Act was passed, which was the first legislation to tackle pollution. And it gave authority to the Army Corps of Engineers to issue permits for discharging refuse into navigable waterways. Then in 1948, the Federal Water Pollution Control Act was passed, which was the precursor to the Clean Water Act. The Clean Water Act has probably the shortest name of any of these federal bills, but there were lots of other ones. So the Federal Water Pollution Control Act provided state and local governments with funds to address water pollution problems. The primary responsibility and power regarding water quality rested with the states. And that is where the power, or lack thereof, really stayed until the Clean Water Act in 1972. So in our area, one of the longtime polluters was the International Paper Company's Ticonderoga Creek paper mill on the lake's New York shores. And it's actually International Paper that pushes legislators to really see the need for federal regulation and not just state regulation of water. So the plant, which had been in operation since the late 1800s, had consistently dumped runoff and sludge into the lake, causing pollution and harming the ecosystem. And the image you're looking at here is courtesy of the Ticonderoga Historical Society and shows the mill in the late 50s or early 60s. So in 1970, then Vermont Attorney General and future Vermont Senator Jim Jeffords spearheaded legal efforts against International Paper. International Paper argued that they were not the only manufacturer contributing to pollution in New York, and so they should not face financial repercussions. The case went to the Supreme Court and ended in a settlement. International Paper paid $750,000 to Vermont, and Vermont used the money to create a fund to monitor the environmental practices of IPC's new paper mill. And over the last 40 years, IPC has faced additional protests and lawsuits targeted at its environmental violations. But at the same time, they've made tremendous strides to decrease pollution. So it's a really complicated picture. But what was actually unique about the Jeffords case was that one state, Vermont, was suing a company in another state, New York, for polluting its waters over in Vermont. Vermont couldn't regulate International Paper, but Vermont was feeling the negative impact from their pollution. And while I will say, I know this is not a presentation about Jim Jeffords, I did find this image in the collection of the Vermont Historical Society during my research. And I will never, ever give up the opportunity to highlight one of my favorite categories of historical objects, the campaign potholder. So this is a campaign potholder from one of Jim Jeffords' races for Vermont Attorney General in the 1970s. And it says, "Don't get burned with inexperience. Let Jeffords handle the hot issues." And I don't know if anyone has seen campaign potholders, but they were pretty ubiquitous in the mid-20th century. And they were actually an attempt to target female voters. There's an idea in 19th century American history that's often called Republican motherhood. This idea that the home is the domain of the woman. And even though she can't vote, it's where she can flex her political muscle by convincing her husband whom to vote for. So once women did get the right to vote, the idea was extended into kind of a post-Cold War version of this phenomenon in which women were specifically targeted through their connection to the home through campaign materials like potholders. So a little aside, but like I said, a good campaign potholder is never a waste of time. So a series of devastating environmental events in the mid-20th century shined a light on the need to protect the nation's waterways, including Lake Champlain. As the quality of the water worsened in waterways across the nation, citizens protested the inaction of their government officials and called on them to pass legislation to limit discharge and toxic waste in the water. What it finally took was people who joined together at the local, state, and federal levels to push for new regulations to protect the environment, which culminated in the passage of the Clean Water Act in 1972. And one of the most iconic moments in American history was, of course, the burning of the Cuyahoga River. By the end of the 1960s, the Cuyahoga River that runs through Cleveland, Ohio, was polluted with thick, dark oil that was actually bubbling on top. It had actually repeatedly caught fire throughout the 1800s and 1900s due to increasing industrialization of the area. This one of the times was in November of 1952, which is the picture you see here. So Time magazine wrote a story in June of 1969 about the Cuyahoga River lighting on fire, but they did use this photo from 1952. The Time magazine report horrified the nation and galvanized the government into creating the one of the things that galvanized the government into creating the Environmental Protection Agency and eventually passing the Clean Water Act. And this image is courtesy of the Cleveland Press collection at the Cleveland State University Library. So it was not only the river, but actually a series of severe environmental disasters and growing public anxiety about air and water pollution that led President Richard Nixon to propose the creation of a new executive agency, the Environmental Protection Agency, or EPA. So the EPA was approved in 1970, and what it did was it consolidated the government's environmental duties under one authority and streamlined consistent policies that were aimed at protecting the environment. The Clean Water Act itself, though, was really born out of decades of smaller legislation and individual and collective action towards protecting the nation's waterways. But there was no action that really matched the scale of that 1972 law. The various smaller laws aimed at water quality reflected the change in scope and the organization of the federal government. These laws were centralized in the EPA and then finally in the Clean Water Act. But concern about water quality continued after the creation of the EPA. So the EPA didn't solve everything. And in 1972, bipartisan congresspeople introduced amendments to the 1948 Water Pollution Control Act. The original law only protected interstate waterways from pollution, while the new proposed amendments gave the EPA expanded control over water quality. And under these amendments, the EPA could regulate and implement pollution control programs for waterways. They could set water quality standards, fund sewage treatment plants, and make it illegal to discharge any pollutants into waterways without permission. And this set of amendments to that became the Clean Water Act. This is a real how a bill becomes a law moment with the Clean Water Act here. So after a series of revisions, the bill passes both the House and the Senate in 1972. The Nixon, however, administration vetoed the bill after deeming it too costly at $24 billion. But both Democrats and Republicans in Congress overwhelmingly overrode his veto. And the Clean Water Act became law on October 19th, 1972, paving the way for safer practices to protect the nation's waterways. This image is of a protest in 1970 in Michigan, where people were protesting pollution of the Huron River, and it's from the Bentley Historical Library at the University of Michigan. So what did the Clean Water Act actually do? Well, it regulated pollutant discharges in the waters of the United States, and it regulated water quality standards for surface waters. The goal was to reduce water pollution through oversight and control from the EPA. The Clean Water Act created a federally controlled permit system for pollution of navigable waters of the United States, specifically aimed at industrial facilities and municipal sewage treatment plants. It aimed to improve water quality and make water what they called fishable and swimmable. What it did not actually do was regulate clean drinking water. That came later with the Safe Water Drinking Act of 1974. But what the Clean Water Act did was create a structure for regulating pollutant discharges into what they called the waters of the United States. And often this part of the bill is referred to as a permit to pollute system, which means that the system legally required a permit before any pollutant could be discharged into a navigable waterway or the ocean. So if you think about it, it is a bit strange to say to a company, we don't give you permission to pollute unless you ask us for permission, and then you will probably maybe get it. But that's the system. It's a permit to pollute system. And when they said pollutants, what they meant were dredge, spoil, solid waste, incinerator residue, sewage garbage, sewage sludge, munitions, chemical waste, biological materials, radioactive materials, heat, wrecked or discarded equipment, rock, sand, cellar dirt, industrial, municipal, and agricultural waste. So it was a pretty wide swath of things that you don't want in your water. And these permits that they gave out as part of the Clean Water Act addressed only what is called point source pollution, meaning pollution into water from a defined source location, like a paper mill that's dumping pollutants into Lake Champlain, for example. But what it did not include was what's called non-point source pollution, which are things like sewage overflows after rainstorms or agricultural runoff, or really any pollutant carried by snowmelt into a waterway. The Clean Water Act also funded sewage treatment plant construction and gave the EPA authority to implement pollution control programs, such as setting wastewater standards for industry. So what I'm often struck by is not so much what the Clean Water Act did as to what it really didn't do. It didn't regulate non-point source pollution or groundwater, and it didn't regulate drinking water, but still, it was still a big step forward. Awareness of environmental issues continued to increase after the passage of the Clean Water Act, and the law did not immediately remedy all water quality problems. The act required subsequent amendments to strengthen it and expand the authority of the EPA. Even then, however, water quality issues persisted. I talked about non-point source pollution in the example of snowmelt, and the heavy use of salt to de-ice roadways began in the 1940s and continued after the passage of the Clean Water Act and its amendments. And the negative effects of road salt on drinking water and water quality were not studied by the EPA until the 1970s, and the use of road salt still remains an issue of debate. Today, there is a lot of work being done with the community to encourage reduced use of road salt to reduce impact on the environment. The Clean Water Act also set the stage for subsequent policies and action, including the creation of the Lake Champlain Basin Program in 1990. This international coalition between the United States and Canada is devoted to protecting the waters of Lake Champlain. In 1990, Vermont Senator Patrick Leahy, along with then Vermont Senator Jim Jeffords and then New York Senators Daniel Patrick Moynihan and Alphonse D'Amato, introduced the Lake Champlain Special Designation Act of 1990 as another amendment to the Clean Water Act. As I mentioned, the names of the amendments just keep getting longer and longer, but this is a great one. Now, these elected officials recognize the national significance of Lake Champlain and hope to secure special federal funds to study and preserve it. The Lake Champlain Special Designation Act was included and passed as part of the Great Lakes Critical Programs Act, which was expansive legislation that used federal funds to protect other waterways, such as the Great Lakes. Commitment to protecting the nation's lakes bound some of our elected officials together, who used their power and status to pass this federal legislation. Senator Leahy from Vermont was instrumental in the creation and passage of the Lake Champlain Special Designation Act of 1990, and he continues to be an advocate for the protection of Lake Champlain and other watersheds. In addition to developing the Lake Champlain Basin Program, Senator Leahy has secured funding for preventing the spread of invasive species in the water and the forests, advocating for ocean conservation, and hosted environmental summits on the stewardship and cleanup of Lake Champlain. So the Lake Champlain Basin Program was born out of that 1990 legislation. The program was a coordinated effort among the federal, state, and local governments who joined together to develop a plan to improve, restore, and maintain the water quality of Lake Champlain. With international cooperation from Quebec, LCBP researches the lake, educates the public on how to play a role in protecting the lake, and funds and implements efforts to protect the inhabitants and water quality. And today, the fight for clean water in the Lake Champlain Basin area continues. And individuals play an important role in protecting water quality by engaging in sustainable and protective actions every day. Towns and municipalities are updating their wastewater plans and protecting clean drinking water. State and federal officials are elected to uphold and create new policies that ensure a healthy water future for everyone. And after the passage of the Clean Water Act, debates continued over federal regulation of waterways and water quality. You've heard me say a few times the phrase waters of the United States, which was the phrase that the Clean Water Act coined to refer to waterways that are regulated under federal control. But depending on your perspective, this can mean different things to different people. Does it include wetlands? Does it include a stream that dries up in the summer? Does it include a floodplain? In 2015, then President Barack Obama put in place the Waters of the United States rule to broaden federal protection for wetlands, streams, and small waterways that previously had not been protected under clean water legislation. Environmentalists had long argued that the pollution and damage of the small waterways affected drinking water and the ecosystem of the wetlands and also required federal protection. However, in 2017, the EPA, under the administration of President Donald Trump, rolled back these federal protections, arguing that the Waters of the United States rule was an example of federal overreach and harmed small businesses and landowners across the country. Those who agreed with President Trump also advocated for state control over waterways, as opposed to federal regulation. In 2021, the Biden administration filed a legal action to begin the process of repealing the rollbacks from Trump's presidency, aiming to restore federal protection of small waterways and wetlands. And at the start of this year in 2020, the Supreme Court agreed to hear a case in this upcoming term starting this fall that would define what constitutes waters of the United States. So this issue and so many issues of clean water continue to be legislated and are playing out in real time. And these are some pictures here of people protesting and speaking at the State House in Vermont to advocate for clean water. So despite the large victory symbolized in the passage of the Clean Water Act, the law did not immediately remedy all problems or relieve waterways from pollution. Protest groups continued to advocate for stringent amendments to the law and government action, sparking a new environmental justice movement in the 1980s, led by communities that had traditionally not been included in advocacy efforts. Systemic racism intertwined with government inaction on water treatment, inspections, and harmful industrial dumping practices in communities led to devastating water-related tragedies. These issues continue today, exemplified by the Flint water crisis in 2014. City and state officials in Flint, Michigan switched the drinking water supply to the corrosive water from the Flint River and failed to treat it, causing lead from unchecked pipes to leach into the water supply and harm thousands of primarily African-American adults and children. The environmental justice movement of the 1980s and the Flint water crisis in 2014 demonstrate the uneven application of the Clean Water Act and the need for government officials to uphold the legislation and, importantly, the power of protest and advocating for those who have been left behind. So there's lots of discussions ongoing today about how to enforce and expand or shrink the Clean Water Act. And advocates place less emphasis on individual action and instead call on the government to fully enforce the law. The country's waterways still face major threats from climate change, invasive species, runoff, waste, and pollution. Unsafe drinking water continues to plague the nation, with minority communities unfairly and disproportionately affected. Strong government action on major threats to clean water will help to safeguard our waterways. And while our elected officials continue to debate and take action or not take action on clean water, individuals and communities are contributing to the effort to keep water clean too. Towns and municipalities are working to meet new wastewater regulations, while individuals and businesses are mowing their lawns higher, avoiding the use of lawn fertilizers, and working to prevent runoff. Our actions in our everyday lives impact lakes, streams, and connected waterways. And just as Congress ushered in the Clean Water Act in the 1970s, which was landmark legislation that helped to protect our waterways for years to come, individuals, communities, and elected officials today have the responsibility to uphold these policies and continue to protect our water, air, and environment. We all have a role to play in keeping our water clean. Thank you so much for joining me tonight, and I'd be happy to take some questions if there are any.
Thank you, Susan. I certainly learned a little bit about campaign potholders. That was exciting. Very interesting part of Champlain Valley history. Yeah, so if folks have questions, feel free to add them to the Q&A section or the chat section. Our first question is, what's our greatest threat to water quality in the Lake Champlain Basin and beyond? And what's your thinking on steps to resolve?
That is a great and complicated question. And I think a lot of the questions around clean water are, it's never one thing and it's never one answer. And it took us hundreds of years to get to where we are in Lake Champlain in 2022. We don't have hundreds of years to get out of it, but I would say that it's a really complicated issue. You know, there's a lot of things. There's all of the runoff issues from agriculture are a huge issue to water quality, as are fertilizers from lawns. I think that often agriculture is the number one culprit, but also the agricultural community is doing a lot to try to improve water quality. So I wish that I had one thing and one answer, but actually it's there's a lot of things, and the answer is both. Well, the answer I believe is both regulation and environment and government involvement, and also individual action as well. It was kind of a non-answer. I feel bad about that.
It's a big question for sure. Great. So do you have any ideas on ways that we can engage youth or other groups with water quality challenges in Lake Champlain, maybe through shipwreck education or lake trips, or any other ideas that you might have?
Tom, I feel like this is a leading question. Yes. I do think it is so important for young people to have a personal connection to Lake Champlain. It is a lot of the work we do at Lake Champlain Maritime Museum is getting kids on the water or in the water. And too often we see that students and youth of our region don't feel like the lake belongs to them. They feel like the lake is for people who have boats, or the lake is for people who are rich. And we get a lot of kids, too many kids, who come to the museum and they've never actually been to the lake before, and they've lived, within 10, 15 minutes of it for their entire lives. So that's something we're really working on doing, and that I think will have a huge impact in future generations, is helping kids have that personal connection to the lake by getting in it or on it or under it, like however you want to get involved in Lake Champlain. We have found that once people have that personal connection, once they watch a sunset, once they take a water sample and are looking at it under a microscope and seeing all of the things that are teeming within it, that's a moment that they don't forget, and they bring that with them. And then they are more committed to making decisions that will keep the lake like the place they want it to be.
That's wonderful. So another question, what are some ways that people can learn more about the 50th anniversary of the Clean Water Act if they're interested?
So I have a very nerdy personal passion about taking incredibly complicated federal legislation and making it understandable to people. So I love this stuff, but it is really complicated. And sometimes I think that these laws are, they can feel almost intentionally complicated, like they were made for people to not understand them. So I think that there are so many great efforts happening around the basin to try to help people know what was in the Clean Water Act at all. It's going to events at Adirondack Water Week. Lake Champlain Maritime Museum just launched a digital exhibit about the Clean Water Act too. So you can go to our website, our digital museum section of our website, and check out the whole exhibit with, if you can believe it, even more detail than I said today. There's a lot of layers of government names of bills that were involved in the passage of this act. And there's great programming happening around the region too, through the Lake Champlain Basin program. They have I think they have a 50th anniversary events calendar, so you can look and see all of the things that are happening around the region too.
Great. So if there's no more questions for Susan, I think we'll end on.
Yeah. Sorry. There was one more from Bill had another question about environmental justice that I'd be happy to talk about.
Oh, great. Yes.
Yeah. Go ahead.
Yeah. What is your thinking around environmental justice in your work and water quality? How do we ensure that all people care?
And I didn't want to miss that, because I think the issue of environmental justice is such an important one. And environmental justice is the concept that the people who are most negatively impacted by pollution and environmental degradation are often communities that have the least power and the least voice, and are mainly minority communities. So, and you see that even you see that in New York and Vermont on both sides of the lake as well. So another big issue, I love that Bill only asks big questions, and it does partially come down to, right, opportunities for people to access the water and kind of make a personal connection to it is key. And everyone deserves that opportunity, and not everyone has it. So always working for that. Also, I think there is a lot of emphasis placed on individual action when individuals are not the cause nor the answer to the problem. So, we also do a lot of work around microplastic and plastic pollution, which is super important, not great at all. And the reality is, like, I could never buy a plastic shampoo bottle again for the rest of my life. And if large companies aren't regulated and are still just dumping microplastic into our waterways, my shampoo bottles are not going to mean anything. So I think individuals are often told that we have to care by taking small actions, which are totally important. I don't want to sound too negative. Like, you also should not use plastic water bottles. We can all agree on that. But also, I do think that a lot of the issues they're large issues that need to be managed by government regulation, including issues around environmental justice, which is why it has been so great to see that the Environmental Protection Agency is prioritizing environmental justice in their programming and funding and projects that they're doing right now. And on the EPA's website, they have a whole dedicated page to environmental justice efforts, defining what it is, getting the term out there so people talk about it. It is, the movement was started in the 1980s, and it still is kind of a new term. Not everyone knows the term environmental justice and what it means. So talking about it more and talking about its impact, specifically on communities of color, I think is really important to making changes that will alleviate that in the future. And also getting up, we just had a primary here in Vermont. So a lot of it comes back to creating opportunities for people of color to run for office. And that often means decreasing the barriers to participating in elected office, right? Like, it's hard to be an elected official. You don't get paid. You really barely, especially in Vermont, you barely get paid. Like, the timing doesn't work if you have a job. All those things that keep people from taking the seat at the table that is theirs will then, translate into seeing communities of color negatively impacted by pollution as well.
Thank you, Susan. So kind of along these same lines, how do we, and you mentioned that the Maritime Museum recently moved to a more accessible ticketing system, so it's free to all folks who visit the museum. Do you have any other ideas that we can make this type of programming more accessible to communities of color, historically excluded communities? Do you have any other ideas on things that organizations could be doing right now that might not be doing already in their programming?
Yeah, that's a great question and a great effort overall. I always think that partnerships with public school systems are really key to that. Even at the Lake Champlain Maritime Museum is free, and that's great, but it's not enough to just say like, hey, the gates are open. You have to also make it a welcoming experience. You have to have your staff trained to welcome people who are different than them. You have to provide opportunities for people to get there. So one of the efforts that we're doing now is also free field trips for schools, but those free field trips also pay for transportation. So we're actually paying the schools for the busing of kids to the museum. So I think those models where you are not only opening the doors, but actually getting people to them and then making them feel welcome when they're there are really key. And it's something people are doing more and more. And I think it's working. I hope it's working. It's just a start, and there's definitely more to do, but it has been really rewarding, I think, in my career in museums so far, to see that change happen from saying, the model is no longer, it's on you to come to us. The model is, it's on us as people who are working in this field to come to you. And so that change I see happening both at the Maritime Museum and at lots of other organizations around the region and around the country, with these really strong school partnerships and community partnerships as well.
Great. Thank you, Susan. So if there's no other questions, I'd like to end on asking Susan, do you have a favorite way to enjoy Lake Champlain? Do you have a favorite activity or a favorite thing to do on the lake that really excites you and makes you passionate about clean water?
Oh, that is a really great question and a fun one to end on. I am a paddler, so I love kayaking and canoeing. I will say I've never, like, even the ones that are exciting are never bad, right? So just this weekend I did canoe camp with my family on Burton Island in the lake, which was pretty amazing. So that is definitely up there, to be able to be in a boat propelled by you that takes you from one place to another and then sleep there is a pretty special thing. And to be able to see the lake, the moon kind of rising over the lake, reflecting off of the water, gives you a real appreciation for how lucky we are to live here and to have Lake Champlain as our backyard. And a good reminder that we should all be doing everything we can to make sure that it is available to everyone and clean and healthy and there for us in the future, just like we want it to be.
Great. Thank you, Susan. I'm going to add a list to the Adirondack Water Week events in the chat so everyone can view those. I want to say happy Adirondack Water Week to everyone. And again, thank you, Susan, for joining us tonight. This was wonderful, really good conversation. Thank you for all the work you do, and thank you for spending some time with us this evening.
Oh, thanks so much for having me. That was really fun. Happy Water Week.
Happy Water Week, everyone. Thank you for tuning in.